Welcome back to Deprogrammed. This is the New Culture Forum show committed to fighting back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name is Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm thrilled to be joined again today, as ever now, by Connor Tomlinson, the host of Tomlinson Talks at thelotuseaters.com, and our special guest this week, Calum Nicholson, the director of the Climate Policy Institute in Budapest, the incoming director of research at the Danube Institute, and I suppose it would also be fair to say a critic of the politicization of science by managerial elites, whether at global institutions like the World Economic Forum and COP26 and that sort of thing, or national elites in countries like Britain. Now, Calum, thank you very much for coming onto the show.
Thanks for the invitation. Good to be here.
Yes, and you and I met, I suppose it was about 6 months or so ago at a conference in Uppsala, Sweden, when we were discussing the politicization of science and the way in which science is frequently misused by elites. And we'll get into some of the more general matters there later. But first, I think it's fair to say, so obviously there's an election going on, and we recently had on Peter Whittle, our director's flagship show, Whittle, which goes out every Sunday, we had Peter Hitchens on, and he was warning about the perils of an incoming Starmer government, and as well as talking about all of the constitutional upheaval that would result from Starmer entering number 10. One thing that he emphasised in particular was Starmer's green zealotry, even more green than the Tories. And to give you 2 points of contact with this, which I think are the most significant ones, Connor will have some to mention later as well, bringing forward our pursuit of net zero from 2050 to 2030 and completely discontinuing any issuing of new oil and gas licenses in the North Sea. Overall, given that sort of mood that's going to enter Downing Street, what do you think that the perils are for Britain of a Starmer government committed to that level of green zealotry?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think what we've seen in the last 10 years, certainly on the left, is what I'd call ideological gentrification, where we've had middle-class preoccupations, middle-class moral panics push out the interests of most normal people. And I think we're seeing this with the Labour government, and I think particularly regarding issues around climate and so on, where people are trying to put an ideological agenda ahead of when they're trying to put what they think ought to be in an ideal world ahead of what is, and in fact what we realistically need at a day-to-day level. When they're trying to put the ideological stuff ahead of what we need today, I think we need to be a bit cautious about that. Taking the 2050 goal was always, I think, an ideological statement that would be quite difficult to commit to. I mean, that's 30 years away. It's too far in the future to be able to predict anything. I mean, no one in 1990 could be predicting what's happening in 2020. Particularly because the Soviet Union only fell, a few months later. So, and I think similarly, so moving up to 2030, in some ways looks more realistic, but actually given what the goal is, it's actually no more realistic because it's putting the ideological agenda even further ahead of the realities of what people need. And in terms of, I think you also mentioned oil.
Oil and gas licenses in the North Sea, yes.
Yeah, once again, if we put some sense of an aspiration for purity, in this case, I suppose environmental purity, ahead of reality, then I think we need to be quite cautious about that. I think it's worth noting that across the culture right now, particularly on the left, but also somewhat on the right, actually, there is a preoccupation with purity. It's quite a Puritan movement we're seeing. You look at the social justice movements, it's about sort of moral purity in relation to your relations with others. You can look at the environmental movement, it's about purity in terms of the consumption of resources and against nature and the environment and the world, the planet. But these are it's funny, we live in such a secular age now, and I think most people who believe these things think of themselves as not religious. But actually, that instinct for purity is a very sort of Protestant, almost millenarian movement.
Yes.
I think to sum up, I suppose, I think a lot of this stuff is just, again, ideological gentrification.
Well, it's nice to see at least some members of the Church of England believing in something, I suppose. Connor, you must have thoughts on this.
Yeah, it reminds me, when you say it's almost as a Puritan aspect, I think often the nature worship, the conceptualization of Earth as a Mother Gaia against who mankind have transgressed by adopting the Industrial Revolution and trying to lower infant mortality and trying to increase prosperity beyond privation. A lot of the climate change activism and policy, given the inordinate expense that William Nordhaus has said, for example, if you spent all of the money that the UN say you need to on their climate policies, you're actually going to do more damage than just letting the IPCC's predictions let rip. It reminds me kind of a tithe system but it also takes on the pagan aspect, and it also takes on a Puritan aspect, as Max Weber would have said about Puritanism in Protestant ethic. Kind of a revelation of your predestined fate, whether for heaven or hell, through working to reveal yourself through grace. So the amount of stuff that you do for the climate, you can reveal whether or not you'll be spared being submerged up to your eyeballs when the ice caps melt or something like that. but when you say about the timeline being inconceivable, it does remind me that lots of these politicians in our gerontocracy, no offence to any of the older members in our audience who watch this stuff because they want to pay forward a better world to their grandparents. You hear a lot of that from often childless politicians who say this: we've got to impart a greener world into the next generation. Well, first of all, you wouldn't have spent so much money and indebted us forever in order to pay for it. But second of all, one of the absurd markers of this was, did you see the ECHR case that was recent, where they used Article 2 and Article 8?
In Switzerland?
Yes. Greta Thunberg was celebrating this because 4 old women brought to the court, one of them died during the processes of this, the fact that because the world was getting hotter and they couldn't go on holiday, they couldn't swim in their swimming pool, and they couldn't sit out on the balcony without a hat on, and I'm not even exaggerating, this is genuinely the ruling, this is violating their right to life and privacy, and therefore climate change is a security threat which all member states of the ECHR now have to take action on, even if they've distended their net zero goals. I think this is utterly absurd, and it's a complete inversion of the democracy by the dead idea, of where you've now got the ultimate of luxury beliefs being transposed upon people that are struggling upwards, just ahead and out of time. I think it's mad.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the word revelation there, because something that I think is quite interesting about the climate debate is that I think it is often described as an apocalypse, the climate apocalypse. But actually the word apocalypse has 2 meanings. The modern meaning is a cataclysm, but it had an original meaning, which was revelation. And I think if you look at a lot of these movements happening now, they're often discussed as apocalypses in a cataclysmic sense. But I think they also, if we look at them a bit more dispassionately, they are quite revealing about the pathologies in our culture, of the way we look at the problems we face and so on. So, I find that these women may be concerned about the coming climate apocalypse, but actually I think it is quite revealing of the sort of the narcissism, I think, that's come into the culture. This idea that if everything isn't exactly perfect at all times, and we're not comfortable in every way, there's something wrong, which speaks to the broader, I think a similar movement that's been happening the last 10 years is the mental health movement. Like, I think it's really good that things like depression are no longer stigmatized. I remember 20 years ago, if someone had depression, it was kind of taboo. No one really knew what it meant. If someone saw a psychologist, it was something you wouldn't admit. I think in a similar way how back in the 1940s or 50s people wouldn't speak the name of cancer, it was kind of seen as something you wouldn't admit to, but then luckily we got over that. And I think similar with depression, it's good that we got over the prejudice against that. The problem is we've now gone from a more empathetic sort of view of mental health to thinking mental health is something, or mental health problems are something to be proud of, and indeed can be an identity. And it's become this sort of this total preoccupation with the idea that if anything in your life is stressful, that's a mental health challenge in some way. But life is stressful. I don't know what your lives are like, but every day I suppose I have things that I find stressful or anxiety inducing. Yes. And I'm not calling a psychologist to deal with it. I'm not taking a drug to deal with it. I'm not calling on Article 2 or Article 8 to say, protect me from these stresses of life. Yes. Life is stressful. And I think one of the dangers we're running into now is that, again, this Puritan idea that if you look at all these movements right now, they're all based on the idea that life is perfectible, that there's a version of life out there that's just right, where everything's smoothed over and your life is frictionless, which is a very sort of, I don't know, maybe an Amazonian, in terms of Jeff Bezos and Amazonian view of life, that the perfect life is where everything is served to you instantly with no friction, just one click and you have it. It's that same sort of ethic of, it's quite a neoliberal idea that services are about removing all of the granularity from your life. But there's a great philosopher, Wittgenstein, where he kept saying, back to the rough ground, yes. And because that's when we know where we are, and that's what makes us human. And I think if you look at the example you raised with these women, I think what it speaks to is less a problem with the climate, but perhaps more a problem we have about the implied attitude or worldview that life should be frictionless.
If I might throw in another esoteric philosophical reference, when you said there about the Amazonification of everything, it was reminding me, I've used this analogy before, to do with Heidegger's concept of standing reserve. This is the ultimate example that the modern environmentalist movement is not, they're not conserving nature for its own sake. They don't even have a deep affinity for the green and pleasant hills of the UK, because they would quite happily concrete over all of it to battery farm anyone from everywhere all at once. Everything's very instrumental, everything's very technical, everything's very scientific. They have a therapeutic approach to themselves and the outside world as what Heidegger would have called standing reserves. So everything is resources, everything can be compartmentalized and packaged and put on a shelf and taken off and deployed elsewhere, as if everything is fundamentally swappable and changeable and fungible. And so it's akin to treating the Amazon rainforest as an Amazon product listing, as if you could just take it from one place and put it in another in case we needed to have enough carbon sequestration in the Pacific Islands or something like that. You know, it's very absurd, and so it doesn't have the same sort of tie and affinity for a particular land, a particular place, a particular people that cultivated that land with hedgerows in the countryside, as you would read in something like Scruton's Appreciation of the Countryside. There's a very big divide between those people that have a love of their homeland and the place particularly in it, and this international environmentalist movement that treats everything, including the people and the air they breathe, as resources.
Yeah, not to intensify the pompous references too much, because I love them through and through, but I do want to say as well that when Heidegger was talking about that, precisely that kind of mentality, he had in his sights people like Francis Bacon and Descartes, these people who stood at the forefront of the scientific revolution in the 17th century and who were committed to viewing nature not as something which has any kind of inherent value unto itself, but as a sort of organic material that can be instrumentalized for human ends. And Bacon would talk about how the whole promise of the scientific project is through man's investigation of the efficient and material causes of things, we can instrumentalize nature in precisely that way. But crucially as well, and this is where it diverges from the millenarian worship of Mother Gaia, which is so common among people like Greta Thunberg and her entourage, for the relief of man's estate, is what Bacon says. The idea is that man will become the master and possessor of nature. And so to that extent, Bacon actually stands at the forefront of precisely many of the developments that these people lament, namely the Industrial Revolution, the idea that man is instrumentalizing nature for his own purposes. What's been lost is that the instrumentalization of nature is still there on this incredibly millenarian green view of the natural world, but man is written out of the picture, and man is viewed as a sort of cancer on the face of the earth. So it takes on a much more anti-human guise, which was not there in those earlier developments of the scientific project in the 17th century. Do you sense that there's a division within the green movement on this score? That there are people who are green for what they would genuinely and sincerely regard as humanitarian reasons, and there are others who are green in a much more apocalyptic, anti-human sense of the word?
Yeah, I think there's quite a clear split between the sort of a technocratic mindset, which sees the world as sort of almost a digital thing that could be put into a spreadsheet, and the more analog view, which has a more of an aesthetic sensibility. There's a quote that I'm just trying to remember, and I can't remember the exact quote, but it's from Yeats, and it said, "But what is Whiggery? A rational, rancorous perspective that's never seen out of the eye of a saint or out of a drunkard's eye." I'm misquoting it. I can't remember exactly the full quote.
People should look it up on Google, because it sounds
it's a good quote, and the basic point is that this idea that things can be progressed in a sort of an efficiency sense, like an Amazon warehouse would run, that there is a perfect form of running things, I think is to misunderstand the human condition. That the human condition is, for me, what makes us human. And what is a feature, not a fault, is precisely the plurality of our perspectives. So I think often if you look at a technical mindset, it believes there is one perspective, that if we could all just adopt the right one, the same morality, the same way of looking at the world, the same politics and so on, somehow the world would be better. But actually it's precisely the creative tension between the plurality of our perspectives that I think is precisely what makes us human. Friction for me is a dependable source of illumination. You rub things together, you get some light, maybe a bit of heat, but heat and light aren't unrelated. It's just a matter of how we conduct it. So it's so I do think there is this tension in the green movements, and the danger is, I think, this idea that all we need is everyone to have an MSc in environmental science. But actually there's another way to know about the land, which is then to have worked on it for a long time. And I find it very interesting now that society is more likely to give a job managing agriculture to a 23-year-old with an MSc in ecology from Sussex University, rather than someone who's been working in farming for 30 years but perhaps has no degree.
Yes.
And there's I remember a quote from when I was at university. I asked a professor once, I was complaining to this professor about the audit culture, the way that now in classes we had to give, they started bringing in when I was a student that we would...
The audit culture.
Audit culture. So what would happen is you'd go to a lecture and at the end you had to fill in a form of how good the lecture was. And I always thought this was quite offensive or insolent, because I thought, who am I to judge? I'm 19 or 20 and the professor's been doing it 30 years. And I remember speaking a few years later to a colleague of mine, and I was complaining about this, and he'd been working for 30 years in academia, and he made a really interesting observation that I think about quite a lot. He said, I know when a lecturer is a good lecturer. I can stand outside the door and I can feel the buzz. Now what he actually meant by that is that his experience knows he just sometimes has intuitions. Another example of this actually, that's perhaps a better illustration. About 3 years ago I had a nerve problem in my back, and it was quite painful. And I went to see this physiotherapist in Oxford, and he was about 55, I guess. And he put me on the table and he moved my leg a bit. And after a while he goes, I can't prove it to you, but it's sciatica. And I thought it was a really interesting comment. I said, how do you mean, that's interesting. I said, I believe you, it probably is sciatica. But I said, what do you mean you can't prove it? And he said, I've been doing this 30 years and I've seen thousands of patients, and I just know, but I can't give you any evidence for that. It's just experience. And he was right, that's what it was. And we had this conversation after that about this idea of experience leading to insights and intuitions that you can't prove in any external data sense. And he said that there's been a big shift in the culture of medicine in the last 30 years. He said it used to be if you had a doctor who had 30 years experience, people would defer to their experience and understood the value of experience and the intuitions that come from that can't really be expressed, the seeing of patterns perhaps. But he said that now that, I think in that case the NHS is so data driven, if you can't provide the data, they think there is no evidence. And I think it speaks to this distinction between sort of a technocratic view and one that prizes experience. And I think if you look at the Green movement, it's a similar distinction, because what is experience? Experience is always of a particular time and place, a locale, a particular ecology, particular history and context, whereas a technocratic mindset is always abstracted.
Yes.
And if I could just add a further comment to this, that one of the frustrations I find with the framing of the climate movement is it's a very high-handed, technocratic, sort of gossamer discussion, discussed at international conferences with great pomp and ceremony, but it's never very granular. And it's interesting because they always, talk about the science, but there's not much consideration of locality in it. And it was worth noting that climate as a concept is climate change is defined in two terms. First, a global average. So it's not the temperature in any one place, it's the global average when we hear about 3% or whatever. It's also a 30-year rolling average. And that's what climate change is. It refers to a 30-year rolling average. But the truth is that those levels of abstraction, a planetary spatial perspective and a 30-year temporal perspective, those
are granular at all.
Well, it's not, because our lives are always lived here and now. And so actually this level of abstraction, it's not that the climate analysis is wrong. It's a good analysis, but it's a level of abstraction, temporally and spatially, at which we do not live our lives. And so this is one of the difficulties, that it's not that the climate discussion is wrong as such. The question's about not its truth, but its use. What value is it in our day-to-day lives, and indeed the policies we write? And policies must be for a time and place. So I'm sure we'll come back to it, but this is one of my frustrations with the climate debate, because I think again, it's not that it's wrong and we must deny the science.
Yes.
But my point is, what do we do with that science?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that, perhaps to lead in with another obscure philosophical reference, but what you're essentially outlining there is...
I love them.
I suppose it's what
no, really,
we're meant to do.
I do.
It's Oakeshott's distinction between technical and practical knowledge.
Yeah.
It's the perception by the technocratic class. You could definitely put probable future Prime Minister Keir Starmer in this,
Yes.
where they could flat pack assemble a civilization as if it's out of an IKEA booklet, versus the kind of person that has studied as a cabinet maker under a mentor that might have been their father or their grandfather, and shapes it together and does things in a traditional way. And they might not be able to explain how exactly the dye works at a granular level, but they do know it comes out with this finished product and this sort of Damascus pattern effect. And when you said about having someone in an MSc run a farm and fill out all these spreadsheets and get the perfect amount of fertilizer and grow a crop, I would far trust less someone like that from DEFRA, some white horse bad, to come out and run a farm than anyone, for example, as we've seen on Clarkson's farm, Jeremy Clarkson, who's just picked up as tutelage under some 20-year-old who's grown up, Caleb Cooper, grown up on the land, farmed at many farms for how many years, and has produced something prosperous and beautiful. And I think getting in touch with those people that do have an ergonomic understanding of the land that they live on is much better. And from there, that flows out to you care and consider the people in the local village, the people who make their livelihood on that farm, the people who are connected to the great chain of civilization, who planted those trees and now have their animals work among them, versus the sort of Kier Starmer brush off, I prefer Davos to Westminster perspective, who, if we look at his policies with the new Labour Green Plan, this sort of great British energy, publicly funded, basically means the taxpayer is on the hook for when it fails, initiative, he's turned around and said, we're gonna mainly lean into renewables because renewables are very cost effective. And bear in mind they're massively subsidised, so that's hiding the ball on how much money it actually costs. But a little while ago, when I was still in energy policy and had the sort of misfortune of having to attend COP and all these pompous sort of things, but there's a story on that in a second actually. But I did some modelling with a nuclear engineer and came out with, if the UK wanted to go fully renewable by 2030, it would need all the world's battery manufacturing capacity to stop for 10 years and be rerouted to the UK. It would cost £3 trillion, and this was before inflation hit, pandemic aftermath plus war in Ukraine. And it would only meet 26% of energy needs with no backup for blackouts. And I know that that's something similarly right, because the National Grid did their own modelling with slightly different variables and came out with 3 trillion at the same number. So we're going to be on the hook for something comparable to our GDP for energy that doesn't work, just because of this a priori belief in scientific technical expertise that is inconsiderate of the actual human impact on the ground, despite we constantly hear about disparate impact of policies, for example, with race and gender and all that. Suddenly it doesn't matter when we're talking about a global scale and all of humanity. It becomes the Stalin quote of, one death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths is just a statistic. Well, 1 million people suffering with absolutely no lighting is itself a statistic.
Yes, as well, it's very true, and we'll get into this now, because I think that a concern that I think is very present among people who believe in national democracy and feel as though it is being that global institutions, and whether it's supranational ones like the European Union or ones which like the World Economic Forum, which technically doesn't yet have any kind of supranational impact on what happens in the UK, but nevertheless our political class is very keen to fly out there and to get pats on the head from Klaus Schwab and these sorts of people.
Well, they have been appointed the advisory board for our AI policy, so they now do have some appointed power.
Indeed, and they openly boast, and maybe they overstated, I don't know, but they openly boast about having tenterhooks in national governments. We have infiltrated. Klaus Schwab almost belongs in a Bond in a Bond film as some kind of supervillain. But I was wondering, given that you both, and I'll ask you, Calum, first, have attended these sorts of things. I think in your cases, you've both been to COP. How big an influence do you think these sorts of globalist managerial institutions have informing the opinions of national elites and informing their outlook?
Well, actually, your question there links to what you were just saying, and I'll kind of link them a bit. That just to take it back to the cabinet making for a second, I think it's relevant to COP and these big institutions. That I think that distinction between IKEA furniture, the analogy between that and cabinet making is a good one. And there's a great quote you made me think of by Longfellow, and he wrote, I love this quote. It was, "In the elder days of art, builders wrought with greatest care every minute and unseen part, for the gods are everywhere." And it's kind of like with an old cabinet maker. If you look at Victorian furniture, the back side of it is still varnished. Everything is complete. You can look at it from any angle and it's all done. If you get a piece of IKEA furniture, the bit you're not supposed to see is just, it's like cardboard sort of wood, unpainted and so on. And I think this is the difference, that when people do things as a vocation, then they really care about the process, because the gods are everywhere. And I think this is where, if you look at a lot of the climate debate, it's similar, that you have kind of this flat packable idea of how we should all live, which is being exported like IKEA furniture everywhere. I mean, you can go beyond climate. Look at the intervention in Afghanistan. What was that? I mean, it was just, we flat packed, we thought, democracy and governance like it was IKEA furniture and exported it. But this speaks to, I think, what you said about COP is that, another analogy I've used for the intervention in Afghanistan, which is relevant to this, is I think what we were practicing there in our effort to develop Afghanistan and intervene on a fragile state and build its political economy, it was what I term political economic Esperanto. Because the language of Esperanto was founded in the 1890s,
yes.
and the idea was that we needed a universal, quite simple language that everyone could conduct business through, and with a quite simple grammar. But actually the grammar was based on, it made sense, it was a simple grammar if you had a sort of a European background.
Latinate background.
Exactly.
It's a synthetic language.
Precisely,
like Spanish
so
and French. Yeah.
Exactly, and so, but the same when we went to Afghanistan, what we tried to do was to create a sort of political economic Esperanto of how a state should run. That was loosely modeled on what the Americans think they are themselves doing, even though they themselves probably don't meet the criteria of a well-developed state, as was understood in the sort of management consultant documents produced by the Kennedy School of Government about Afghanistan, or the RAND Corporation. But the reason I give that example of Afghanistan and this sort of political economic Esperanto is that I think this is what a lot of these international institutions are doing, because they're not places of somewhere, they're places of anywhere, yeah,
or
everywhere, which is the same as which is closer to being of nowhere
yes.
than of somewhere. And so I think when you look at these institutions, their frame of reference is, again, it's this sort of frictionless. Rory Stewart had a great line about institutions like this. He says you go to these conferences and the language is like the thin. He says you go to the thin air of these conferences, and the gossamer sort of thin technocratic language.
This might be the first approving remark that's ever been made on the New Culture Forum about Rory Stewart.
Hey, Rory Stewart's a great writer. You got to concede he's a very good writer, and but it was an interesting observation, and actually his critique of Afghanistan is actually very, very interesting. But the interesting thing I should say about Rory Stewart, I don't know if anyone knows about Rory Stewart, but is that he had quite an interesting critique of international development in Afghanistan. But what's interesting, his views now, as far as I see, on climate are not subject to his own critique. So he's making the presumptions about climate that he was critiquing others for making the same assumptions in intervention.
Interesting.
Because both of them have the same impulse of big international organizations going in and trying to intervene. And he actually had another great quote, which is worth thinking about, because I think it was well made and it applies everywhere. He said, if we are to understand the failure of interventions in Afghanistan, we need less an anthropology of Afghanistan and more an anthropology of ourselves. And that, I think, is a really interesting idea, that to understand the hubris that captures our whole culture, particularly these international organizations, I think we need less an anthropology of the people, say, impacted by climate, but perhaps an anthropology of how we think about climate at such a high abstract level to begin with. And you mentioned COP, I'd be curious to hear your story. I was at COP2 in December, and COP this year, the Conference of the Parties, it's the big climate conference. It's basically a mashup these days between, a World Cup final being the end negotiations after many, and also Burning Man, particularly in this case, because it was not only a huge cultural festival, but like the World Cup and like Burning Man, it was held in a desert. And but actually last year it was held in Dubai. And the irony of it was unmissable, that there they had this climate conference in an expo center in the scrubland outside of Dubai, and it was completely ringed by the barber pole towers of oil refineries. Yes. And in a city built, of, by, and for oil, And it's, so there was a certain tension there, I felt. But I have to say that only late stage capitalism could have built both Dubai and COP as an international jamboree, an international roving sort of revivalist festival. They are absolutely both products, not solutions to late stage capitalism. And I think they very much deserved each other.
Yeah, well, my story of COP26 actually links to this sort of belief of human beings as fungible, infinitely moldable by market demand widgets, which the international institutions, especially the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, they are making forays into climate policy too, seem to take on. Because none of these policies are ergonomic around the geography, culture, temperament of the peoples that they're inflicted on. As you said, they look at it from a global average resolution and presume this is a one-size-fits-all solution to everyone. So when I went to COP, we had a minister from Malawi there, and they were all sitting down talking about the future energy solutions and how we can export renewable technologies around the world and provide developing nations with a roadmap to upgrading their energy infrastructure and getting online and reducing emissions, because everyone knows that if you want to make somewhere more prosperous, you give them oil, gas and coal, burn it as quickly as possible, and then they might be able to get their grid online to adopt new technologies. And the guy from Malawi just said, you are so short-sighted because we're still cooking with dung and wood in closed room huts with no ventilation. And so there are kids dying because they're inhaling this. And if you're telling us to skip out on coal, oil and gas, you are dreaming. We're not going to do it. We are not going to assent to these decarbonisation policies insofar as we don't even have an electric grid up and running. So no offence, guys, but I don't care if you've got a guilty conscience and you want to pay your indulgences, because who is the heiress that's funding the Just Stop Oil protests? She's not the Rockefeller heiress. She's like the granddaughter of this oil baron, and she's the one that's funding a lot of these cultural vandals going up and smashing around copies of Magna Carta and throwing soup on paintings and things like that.
I guess her personal copy of the Magna Carta is probably safe back in the mansion.
In the family library.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, quite. But the people in the developing nations that actually need these technologies to come online, as we once did a couple of hundred years ago, are not assenting to this. But of course, it's often tied to international aid, and you have to sign on to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in order to get lots of UN investment and all this sort of stuff. So you're having these implacable solutions transposed onto nations which are trying to struggle up from the mire of privation with no consideration shown to their particular times, places, cultures and contexts.
So it's very interesting what you're saying, because I find, perhaps this is always the case in history, and correct me if you think it is, but what's really interesting, if you see the climate movement as a sort of revolutionary movement in some way, in my experience, typical or not experience, but my knowledge, most revolutionary movements have been sort of bottom up. You know, the oppressed underclass have overthrown the ruling class. But what's really interesting is that this is being presented in the language of some sort of revolution to save everyone, but actually it's often being prosecuted by the elites, and in many contexts. So, for instance, if you look at social justice and all the sort of ESG sort of and the sort of the concerns for minorities and so on, or the language of it in corporations, it's being driven by the HR departments. What's interesting about that for me is that, as I remember, HR departments, if you're working for a company, HR is not your friend. HR works for the man, right? They keep an eye on you. And but what's really interesting is HR has been repackaged as being fundamentally about caring about the human spirit and your dignity and all the rest of it. And I don't think that's historically what the purpose of HR was. So it's very interesting how they've reupholstered themselves in friendlier, slightly more garish colours. And it's, but it seems to me, again, this sort of, the ideological gentrification of what might be called the left, if you can still call it that.
I would actually gently disagree with you about the idea that revolutions have always been bottom up.
I figured you might, which is why I asked.
Yes,
As do I.
I would disagree with you. It's not, but one thing where I would agree, and I'll explain the reasons for my disagreement briefly. I think there is a variation in the willingness of movements to admit that they have elite leadership. And I think the one thing that we're noticing, and which I think is very brazen in the case of the, whatever you want to call them, the sort of green obsessed, millenarian, climate obsessed elite, there is a sort of shamelessness about their gentrification. They don't particularly claim to be doing it in the name of the people in the way that previous revolutionaries have done so. But even if we were to pick an archetypal democratic revolution, one done in the name of the people, le peuple, in France, it was led by a kind of counter elite, which in the people, the sort of people who were becoming much more socially important in France in the Third Estate, people like Mirabeau was actually an aristocrat, so you did have some aristocratic leadership as well. You obviously have Lafayette, but what actually happens in that case is certain popular grievances around supplies of bread, around these sorts of things, are sort of spearheaded and galvanized by an elite which is willing to take advantage and which poses itself and which positions itself against an existing elite. So I think that all revolutions, certainly in order to be successful and not to just become an ill-distributed mess, do need elite leadership, and there's an overrepresentation of highly educated people in the French Revolution, whether we're talking about Georges-Jacques Danton or Robespierre himself. But in any case, one thing I wanted to get to now is that there's a risk here, and so we're talking about the way in which these global institutions and their lackeys in governments, people like Keir Starmer, I prefer the politics of Davos to the politics of Westminster. We're talking to the way that they're willing to impose immense costs on people. We're talking about the way in which they're actually doing an immense disservice to nature. And indeed, Connor's just been talking about the ways in which they're doing an immense disservice to people in developing countries which don't want to be burning dung and would quite like first world technology to alleviate many of the problems that they're facing in places like Malawi. But a less often made critique is the way in which they're actually prostituting the reputation of science itself by enlisting science into this project of, as you've both been calling it, this sort of flat pack approach to this world political and economic Esperanto, this managerialist approach to politics, this idea that science can be a kind of final authority. And I think it's really worth saying that there is a name for this in philosophy. People might not be aware of it, but it's called scientism, and it's routinely critiqued. And before people get concerned that I'm about to go on some kind of evangelical Calvinist rant against science and say that the world's 6,000 years old, this is not, people who critique scientism are not just religious fanatics. There are some who will be so, but the greatest scientific minds themselves have themselves been against scientism, and whether we're talking about Leibniz or Einstein. Leibniz didn't know the word scientism, but his attitude was very much against scientism. And scientism is basically the idea, I think it would be fair to define it as, firstly, the idea that science can answer all questions, and to the extent that a question is asked that science can't in fact answer, it's not a legitimate question.
Yeah.
Would that be a fair description of scientism?
I think
in your
so.
view?
I mean, my way of phrasing it is that science, proper science, is a guide to the facts that we can put to use, whereas scientism is where we presume that science can be a guide to our values by which we use the facts.
Indeed.
And so in a sense, facts are useful to an end. Yes. But scientism is where you think science can be a guide to the truth, which is not simply I think the truth is often confused with facts,
Yes.
And there are objective facts, but I'm not sure we can talk about objective truth as much. But truth is really about, I think, the composite of values and contextual understandings we have.
Yes, and so the idea would be then that just because there are two critiques that I would want to make of scientism, and you've just named what I would regard as the second one, which is subordinate to the first in my view. The first one is that there's been an understanding among people who've understood science in the right way, and I think probably the most distinguished philosopher of science in the last 100 years is probably Karl Popper, who famously in the academic world at least, defined science as the business of conjecture and refutation. And built into that understanding that there is a conjecture which is made and then there's an attempt to falsify it, this is Popper's falsification theory, is the implicit suggestion, and it's a humble one, it's not an arrogant one, and we're talking about the arrogance of our scientific managerial elites, that all knowledge that they encounter is provisional. So that would be the first thing. Yeah. And if you don't buy into that premise that all knowledge is provisional and can be corrected, not only do you risk imposing the risks of being wrong, the dangers of being wrong, which most science is wrong because it's falsified later on. You risk imposing those dangers onto the population at large, particularly if you're instrumentalizing science for political purposes. So that would be a very grave concern. But it also gives you an intoxicating, almost Gnostic sense of your own position in the world. This idea that science isn't something that we discover through a process, it's a kind of moment. And we were talking about revelation earlier. It's a sort of revelatory moment, and we, being the managerial Gnostic elite, this clearly pervades the attitude of people like Klaus Schwab and people like Starmer who feed off them. We, as the managerial Gnostic elite, can sort of interpret science and scientific truths, the science. They talk about it, it's TM, in these sort of highfalutin terms. It's sort of handed down to us on tablets of stone, and then we, the managerial class, just implement it. But that's not how science works at all, and thinking of it in that way is incredibly dangerous. Again, particularly if you're not just theorizing in your bedroom, but you're actually in government and going to impose these solutions on people. The one that you're talking about, and I agree with as well, is this idea that science is fit to answer all questions, including questions of moral values and political norms and all these sorts of things. And the person who's most crucial here in the history of philosophy is David Hume, who talks about the way in which you cannot, from describing the world in a certain way, you cannot, from an is statement, infer any particular moral and political values as off the back of that. And what happens is that even if we're assuming that the knowledge is not provisional, it's very settled. They always say the science is settled. Even if the science is settled, which in my first critique I've just said is not, that doesn't instantly, no particular moral or political positions follow logically from that. And again in the later Wittgenstein, when he literally says, it's possible that all scientific questions could be answers, and the problems of life would not have been touched. And politics is about dealing with the problems of life, and it's arrogant in the extreme to believe, even if you do have correct scientific descriptions of the world, that your values follow necessarily from that.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that Wittgenstein quote, because Wittgenstein, I think, is a philosopher that is sometimes seen as quite obscure, but I think he's very relevant to today, and I wish people would read him more. But that line of, even when all the problems of science or logic could be solved, all the real problems of life would remain untouched. I think you can take that phrase and apply it to how we look at climate change.
Yes.
Because my view of climate change is simply that, my critique of the way we think about climate change is not a critique of the science. The science is pretty good. It's a critique of scientism. It's the use and misuse or overreach of science. My view is basically that we have quite a rich understanding of the science of climate change, but our understanding of climate change is as informed by an impoverished understanding of ourselves as it is by a rich understanding of the science of climate change. Because ultimately, why do we care about climate change? We care because we presume two things. First, that it'll have an impact on society, and that impact will be negative. So that presumes we know not just what the facts of the science are about climate, but it also presumes we know what society is, and indeed what it ought to be, and indeed how its mechanisms of change are.
Yes.
Now, the reason I'm pretty confident we don't know that is that for 2,500 years, all of Western philosophy has been arguing over questions of what is and what ought to be, and we still haven't come to any real conclusions on this. But again, that's not a fault, it's a feature. It's the human condition, again, is based on a plurality of perspectives. We would not be human if there was a single answer. And so much of life is about the negotiation of these things. But what's interesting, and the reason I mentioned Wittgenstein is, or I'm glad you mentioned him, is that Wittgenstein had this phrase that even when all the scientific problems are solved, all the problems of life remain untouched. I would say even if we had all the scientific answers about climate change, all the real problems of what we do about it remain untouched. So my critique of the climate debate is that at the moment you've got this binary, right? On the one hand, typically on the right, you have what are sometimes called the climate deniers. Now, I do believe those people often have too little faith in the science. But I also think on the other side, call it the activist and typically more left view, those people have an equal or opposite but equal problem, a symmetrical problem to the so-called climate deniers, which is they have too much faith in the social science. So once I have too little faith in the science, I have too much faith in the social science, because you need both. And so I think that when you look at this debate, even when we've solved, so my point is, there is actually a third perspective on climate change. You don't have to be an activist saying, I believe there's a consensus on everything, and you don't have to be a denier saying, I don't believe the science, or even if it's true, we're not responsible. You can actually assume, for the sake of argument, that the science is good, and I think it is pretty good, and indeed that we are responsible. I think it's quite a cautious position, actually. Even if there was a consensus on that science, just for the sake of argument, all the interesting questions and the most difficult questions
would still be there to debate.
We're there to have a debate. What should we do about it? And it's exactly, if I can just draw a quick analogy of another issue where there's been this sort of scientism, and scientism in the sense of forgetting that most of the questions are actually about ourselves and social questions. Thinking the only questions are scientific ones. And an example would be COVID. Personally, I think the science of COVID is pretty good. The virology of the disease, the epidemiology of how it spreads in populations, the virus development, whatever you may think about it, was quite impressive science. Whether it was to cure it or to control us through nanobots in our blood, some people think. Either way, very impressive.
Yes.
So it's
quite,
all power to them. But here's the point with COVID. It was that what we heard governments saying was that their policies were informed by the science of the disease. But actually the question, and this is this question posed by Jonathan Sumption, the question of is there more to life than the avoidance of death is not actually a scientific question. It's a question of culture, values, how we assess risk.
It's a problem of life.
It's a problem of life, and it's not one that goes away with the pandemic either. And so there were questions around COVID that were inherently political and inherently subjective, not objective, inherently plural in our perspectives. And what was needed was not to find the right answer, or even to presume the right answer exists, but actually simply to acknowledge there are a plurality of perspectives, and we should debate those in good faith with civility. But what we saw in COVID, if anyone questioned anything, they were immediately dismissed as someone who didn't care about granny or something.
Yes.
And so it wasn't a constructive debate. And I find the climate debate and the COVID debate very similar like this. I mean, even the language is similar, because in COVID, you remember it said zero COVID as a potential goal. Well, we have net zero in climate. It's very similarly structured goals. You could probably achieve zero COVID if we locked everyone up in perpetuity. We could probably achieve net zero by the same means. But life is about compromise. And this is, I think, what we have today. We have a hubris in society where everyone thinks that answers exist, that we can find them, and then once found, we can act upon them for the greater good and create a singular world where everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet. But actually, that's not how life works. It's a plurality of perspectives, and it's ultimately about compromise.
Callum, you really must join us again soon, because it's been too short-lived. It's been one of the most nutritious conversations we've had on Deprogrammed. I think that's fair to say. I'm sorry I couldn't go on longer. But Connor, thank you very much for joining me as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.